live stream. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, A Talk with Diane Wilson, the author of The Seed Keeper. I want to start by thanking all of you for joining us, both in person in our community room and virtually on YouTube. Sorry, I just lost my place. The program is being recorded, but it will only be available, the recording will only be available for 30 days. I want to be sure to mention that this room is T-coil enabled. If you have a T-coil enabled device, please feel welcome to turn them on at this time. If you don't have one, but would like to sort of test the system, we have headsets that are available at the back of the room. To make sure that the system works, everyone who is speaking needs to use a microphone. While people are busy turning on their T-coil enabled devices, it's a great time to turn off all your other devices. Tonight's hybrid event will run for about an hour, and there will be an opportunity for people who are in the room to ask questions. If you have not already purchased a copy of the book from our co-presenters, Labyrinth Books, we will welcome you to do so at the end of the program. In addition to our treasured partner, Labyrinth Books, this evening's event is made possible with thanks to the Land, Language, and Art, a global initiative from Princeton University Humanities Council, and the Seed Farm. I particularly want to thank Sarah Rivet and Tessa Desmond and the staff they work with for making this evening possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, a conversation with the author Diane Wilson and Tessa Desmond. Tessa Desmond is a scholar and a farmer. She teaches classes on food, farming, and literature in the Efron Center for the Study of America at Princeton University and co-directs the Seed Farm at Princeton and the Princeton Food Project. She also owns a homestead farm where she cares for sheep, chickens, and a big kitchen garden. Her research interests focus on community-engaged scholarship and community seed saving. She is doing a lot of really wonderful, thoughtful, collaborative work at Princeton. If you aren't already familiar with her work, I suggest you become more familiar. Diane Wilson, when the library was first approached as a potential partner, it's possible that everyone in the room did a little dance. We were thrilled at the prospect of welcoming Diane Wilson to the library, and we aren't the only ones. I have heard several people introduce themselves to Miss Wilson by saying, "Hi, I don't want to fangirl too much, but..." And for good reason. Wilson is a writer, speaker, and educator who has published 2 publications. Her novel, The Seed Keeper, was published by Milkweed Editions in 2021. Wilson has received numerous awards and is an executive director for the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, a national coalition of tribes and organizations working to create sovereign food systems for Native people. Wilson is enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. The Cleveland Review of Books said of The Seed Keeper, "The partnership between humans and seeds in The Seed Keeper feels like the earth reaching out to its readers from the book's pages. Both pass knowledge and information to the next generation, their lineages paralleling and tangling. As Rosalie says, when we save these seeds, when we select which ones will be planted again, our lives become braided into the life stories of these plants." Please join me in welcoming Diane Wilson.
Anmatakiapi, Petukinde Iushkian Wachian Kapia, Diane Wilson Namakiapia, Mdewakanton Oyate Hamatahanya, Sichangu Oyate et Omawakia. So hello all my relatives. It's really good to see you here tonight. My name is Diane Wilson, and I am Dakota from the Mdewakanton Oyate in Minnesota, and I'm enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. And I want to express my gratitude to be here on the Lenape-Hoking, the traditional homeland of the Lenape people. So Pidamaya to the Lenape for that, for the beautiful privilege of being here tonight. So I'm also want to thank the Princeton Library and Kim for hosting this event. And I have to especially thank Tessa and Sarah for your gracious, generous hospitality in bringing me out here. Spending time in yesterday's class, Land and Story in Native America, was such a gift to spend time with students, but also just to see this really beautiful work you're doing that's combining stories with experiential learning. And I think that to me is so important in the seed work and in our work in rebuilding relationships with the earth. And I also want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I know it's a nice night out and you're all busy, and also the people who are sharing their time online. So my hope is to talk a little bit about the process of writing The Seed Keeper and why this story is so important to me. And then Tessa and I are going to have a lively conversation, and then we will open up for questions. And I encourage all of you to, to ask anything that you're interested in. I'm happy to answer any question. I always like to see if I can still be surprised by, and I can, just yesterday in class, these students came up with some new ones that made me think. Why did I do that? So thank you to all of you. So when I think about my work, the way I introduce myself is as a gardener and a writer. And that means that I take care of seeds and stories. And those are the two things that have been so important in both my work with nonprofits. I have been executive director for Dream of Wild Health and the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. They both focus on food sovereignty work. And so all of my experience has really gone into writing The Seed Keeper. And I think of, on a deeper level, that both the work I do in nonprofits, or did, I've since retired, and the writing that I'm doing now is all intended, hopefully, to help support the work of cultural recovery in Native communities. So this is my third book for adults. And the first one was a memoir that actually helped me understand how assimilation works across generations in my own family. And then the second book was a collection of nonfiction called Beloved Child that was interviews with elders. And I really wanted to understand historical trauma. And so talking to elders about their experience and then how they dealt with it in their own lives. And it was by writing those two books that then helped me understand how to go ahead, and it gave me the knowledge that I needed actually to be able to write The Seed Keeper. So one of the questions that I often get asked is, how long did it take you? And I hope this is heartening for all you writers out there, but it takes me a really long time to write books. So don't give up, don't despair. It probably, I would say, 8 or 9 years. And, but the reality is that it took me 20 years to learn what I needed to know in order to write it. So and I've had so many great conversations with Tessa and the students and Sarah about seeds this week. So I have to say, I'm just feeling filled up, nurtured, like I had a really good meal. But so 20 years ago, when I was actually just starting to work on a memoir, and I was at that stage of, complete doubt that I could actually write a book, but something, I needed to do that work around my family. And I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my mother was Lakota, enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation, and my dad was Swedish heritage. And so I knew that my mother and my aunts went to boarding school in South Dakota on the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations. But none of us in my family knew why. We didn't know what boarding schools were for. We didn't know about their purpose to assimilate Native children. So when I became an adult, that was the impetus that drove me to start writing, to try to understand how it was that my mother's life was so different from mine, that she would grow up in boarding schools out in South Dakota, and I'm growing up in Minneapolis in white schools. And so, and she didn't like to talk about it either. She would say, we were poor and I'm done with all that. So I guess that's what forced me to become a writer, because I had to articulate the stories that she couldn't. And so she actually collaborated with me quite extensively on that book. She didn't have the ability to articulate what her experience was, but she read everything that went into that book. So while I was working on the memoir and doing all the research, then I heard about this little tiny bare bones garden just south of the Twin Cities. And they were growing out a collection of rare indigenous seeds. And so what I heard was that they had Cherokee Trail of Tears corn, for example, that was originally, it was descended from the seeds carried on that removal. And they also had Hopi black turtle beans that had been a gift from a medicine man from the Southwest. And they had traditional tobacco that was hundreds of years old. And so as a gardener, I just thought, well, I have to go do this. I have to be part of this work. But also as a writer, because the stories that these seeds were carrying, this history. And I thought, well, this is our connection back to ancestors. This is the way that we can connect to those stories without words. And so I saw them as carrying stories of each season, how much rain fell, how hard the wind blew, but also the wisdom of the mother plant herself. So it was total love right away for those seeds. And but what I didn't know when I was starting out as a volunteer was that long history that they carried, or how close they had come to extinction. So the seeds in this collection, there was maybe a handful of each variety, and they were old seeds. And for those of you who garden, you know that with each passing year, your seeds lose viability. So here they are, the precious last remnant. And it was some of the most challenging work to be able to grow those out, to risk those seeds to become plants again. So I became a complete dedicated volunteer for several years until they finally hired me. If you hang around long enough, they'll find work for you. So then in 2008, that's when I went to work full-time for Dream of Wild Health. And that's where my real education began, working with farmers and with Native youth and with elders and with the seeds themselves. And so that was the gift of that time gave me a very different understanding of our relationship to the world. So an indigenous understanding, a worldview that is based on what we say in Dakota, which is mitakuye owasi. We are all related. And that means not only are we all related in this room, but outside, we're relatives to all those birds flying by and to the grass and because you guys actually have grass here in Minnesota, not yet. But everything out there is a relative. And when you have that kind of connection, then you have to think about your actions with regard to that relative in a way that you care for them, you protect them, just as you would your aunt or your mother or your child. And so every morning we would start in circle around a fire before anybody started their work. We would, an elder, a Arapaho elder, Ernie Whiteman, would open the circle in prayer. And so we would smudge with sage and we would offer prayers of gratitude with tobacco to the plants and the animals and the water and the soil, and for their presence in sharing that farm with us. Because the great gift that we receive from seeds and plants and animals is that they are giving their lives so that we can survive. And in turn, we agree to care for them. We provide them with healthy soil, healthy water. And this is what is described as the original agreement between human beings and seeds. As long as we care for each other, we both survive. And so these are some of the teachings that I was learning every day at the farm and seeing them put into practice. So one of the things I mentioned to the students yesterday was that when we first bought our 10-acre farm, the soil was so depleted from conventional farming that it couldn't even grow a cover crop. It was just, it was exhausted. That soil had been used up. And so the only way it would grow anymore was with the applications of fertilizers and pesticides. And as an organic farm, we didn't use any of that. So it took years of adding compost and manure to replenish that soil. But what I saw in that act of reciprocity was transformation. I saw the soil come back. It regained its fertility, and it turned into a thriving farm. And I also saw with the youth, the native youth who would come up from the cities and learn how to garden and how to cook. They learned how to introduce themselves in their language. They worked with elders. And these are youth who, some of whom were coming out of very challenging family situations. But every day they got to come to a place where they could be outside and be kids and eat healthy food and be with elders and learn. And I saw them transform. And so to see the work that these seeds can do when we are in that right relationship with them was such an inspiration for me. It was one of the reasons that I then wanted to write a book, so that I could share that knowledge back with a broader audience. But as part of my learning there, I also learned about that hard history that around our indigenous foods. So before settlers came, the indigenous peoples of the Americas actually developed 3/5 of the world's foods that we relied on today. And these are some really important foods like maize or corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, squash, beans, tobacco, just to name a few. And so you know that these gardeners, they were brilliant agriculturalists. And so this is the legacy of indigenous gardeners that what they've given to the world. And yet, and so in the Midwest, the Dakota people were hunters and wild gatherers of plants, and then also gardeners, growing the Three Sisters garden. So then in the late 1800s, though, when we see this immense clash between cultures and what happens when tribes are moved onto reservations and they lose access to their traditional foods and medicines. And instead, the government gives them commodity foods that are high in starch, high in fat. And within a generation, we start to see the health of our communities decline. And so today, we now have epidemic levels of diseases like type 2 diabetes. And to me, that is directly linked back to this shift when tribes were moved onto reservations, because in a traditional diet, there's no evidence back from that era of any evidence of type 2 diabetes, for example. And so this was an immense shift. And then families aren't gardening the way they were because their food is coming in packages now. And so that affects the ceremonies, it affects the songs, it affects the prayers. And so we start to see the seeds disappear because they're no longer being grown out, they're no longer being taken care of. And so when Ernie Whiteman said to me one day, if you can control the food, you can control the people. And I thought, oh, that's, I hadn't understood the role of food in controlling what happens. And it was also a way of dispossessing tribes from their land. But that's when I realized that I could tell the history of Dakota people in this story through the story of our food. So that's how important food is, and something that we just take for granted, that we so often think in terms of hunger. But yet culture, food is at the heart of our culture. And so that is the work that I have been focused on for many years through nonprofit works and through my writing, is how do we reclaim that cultural legacy? How do we bring back those foods? How do we reestablish the health of our communities? So that's a big part of why I wanted to write this book, was to give back to all the people who have shared with me their teachings, their wisdom. It was a way to give back to the seeds themselves, to make sure that that knowledge goes out to a broader community and that it is passed on to future generations. So these are the ways in which I've been taught the work that we need to do always is to be not only taking care of our seeds now, but also to make sure that we are preparing the next generation to take on that work. So both are really important, the intergenerational piece and the work that we're doing right now in our own lives. And as a writer, I also feel really dedicated to telling stories that have been silenced over the years. And so that in writing the memoir, for me, it was telling my mother's story, and in the way that she represented so many other families whose stories were similar, who had been through boarding school. But at the heart of the novel is actually a story that had been silenced for many years, and that is part of the history of Minnesota that was repressed. And it has to do with the 1862 Dakota War. And so in 2002, I actually participated in what was the first ever Dakota commemorative march. And that was to honor 1,700 Dakota women, children, and elders who were removed from the state following that war. And this is part of the history that you may have heard about the 38 warriors who were hung at Mankato. That's one of the best known pieces. But that is all part of the outcome of that war. The men were sent to Davenport, Iowa. Women, children, and elders were sent to Crow Creek, South Dakota. But the story that I heard on that march was before they were removed, the women didn't know where they were being sent, and they didn't know how they were going to feed their families. So they sewed their seeds into the hems of their skirts, and they hid them in their pockets. So that even when families were starving, they protected those seeds so that they would have seeds to grow in the next season, but also for future generations. So if you think of the strength and courage that that decision took when families are hungry, that these seeds are essential to continuing the future of your people. That to me was such a profound lesson about the responsibility that we carry now for our seeds, and that even though the threats that we face are very different, Monsanto, these international agricultural organizations, the threats are different, but our responsibility is the same. So that was one of the big teachings that I learned at the farm that I wanted to pass on in this book, was that sense of when we're given a gift, we are responsible for that gift. And we then have a responsibility to care for what we've been given. So, and it's actually a joyful responsibility. I don't want that to sound punitive. It is a gift that we've been giving, and we show our gratitude by caring for it. So, so in the book, for those of you who haven't read it, the story is told through the voices of 4 Dakota women across time from 1862 to 2002. And the seeds actually open the book with a poem reminding us about that original agreement where we said we would take care of them and they would take care of us. And so it is really important to me to actually open and close the book with the seed's voice, because in a way then it becomes their story. They are observing the decisions that these women are making and how we are upholding the teachings in our traditional stories, which have laid out the values and the importance of this gift. So that's a secret. That's a tip on reading this book. Think about what the seeds are observing as you go through it. So the main character is Rosalie Ironwing, and she is actually someone that I wanted to show her as the almost the culmination of what assimilation can do to families. So she has lost her own family. She doesn't speak her language. She's not part of her community. So she's at almost the furthest edge you can go without being completely assimilated into mainstream society. And what I wanted to show was that even at that point, there is still a way back. And one of those ways back is through reclaiming this relationship with our seeds and our traditional foods. So the story begins as Rosalie is about to leave the farm where she's lived for 22 years, and she's returning to her childhood home on a Dakota reservation in Minnesota. And she was raised by her father, who taught her a lot about plants until she was 12. And then when he passed from a heart attack, then she was put into foster care. And so from that experience, then she marries a white farmer at a young age as she's searching for safety and stability in her life. And it's in that, in her home with John, the farmer, that she first encounters his mother's seeds and begins to learn to garden. And it's that moment of learning to garden, making that reconnection with seeds, that she starts what is her journey back to her community and her family and their legacy of seeds. And so what I hope the story communicates then is that even when we have lost so much, that these seeds can still bring somebody like Rosalie home. They can bring her back to her community. So I'm going to read a brief excerpt that is from, this is set in 2002, and this is Rosalie meeting her one relative for the first time. And I do tell you this right up in the preface, so it's not a spoiler. But she has just visited her great aunt, Darlene Kilsdeer, for the first time. And so I just want to give you a little sense of these two characters. So this is told in Rosalie's voice. Darlene's voice faded until it was little more than a whisper. The loud tick of the clock on the kitchen wall was the only sound in the room. My eyes were closed, and when I opened them, I saw Thomas holding his head in his hands. Thomas is her son. Darlene's face was drawn and tired, her thin shoulders slumped forward. The nurse appeared and said, "Miss Darlene, you've worn yourself right out." Taking my great-aunt's elbow, she helped Darlene stand up on shaky legs and make her slow way from the dining room table back to the recliner in the living room. Thomas and I followed. The nurse placed the oxygen tube beneath Darlene's nose, hooked the plastic behind her ears, and held out a white pill. Darlene took several deep breaths. Then she sat up, pushed the pill away, and pulled the tube from her face. "I'm not done yet," Darlene said. "There's one more story she needs to know. You really need to take this. I don't have time." With a sigh, she looked first at Thomas and then at me. "We're a mess," she said, "a broken down mess. And we're all that's left. Don't go wasting time feeling sorry for yourself. Plenty of people have had a rough life. You just make the best of it. That's all anyone can do. The two of you still have time to do better. It's up to you. Pointing to the scrawny corn growing in buckets of hard-packed soil, she said, that's the best I could do. Hauled those buckets myself with no help from anybody. All the old people downstairs said, you can't do it. I said, you have no idea. Rosalie, I didn't expect to see you again. I didn't think anyone but me would ever care about these seeds. I thought they'd die with me. But there you sit, my great niece, my last relative. You have the truth and more to take home with you. Nurse, I need my basket, please. We waited in silence for the nurse to return and lay a large hand-woven basket on Darlene's lap. She smiled as her arthritic fingers ran slowly across the rough willow exterior. Reaching inside, she carefully pulled out a piece of deer antler and several small sacks, each one tied closed with a red string. Opening one bag, she shook a few corn kernels into her palm and handed them to me. Tiny jewels of lavender blue, rose, and cream. That's Dakota corn, Wamanaheza, a gift from my great-grandmother, Mahpia Maza, to Marie, and then to my mother, Suzanne. I don't think it's been grown since the summer my sister Lorraine was taken away to boarding school. Every fall, we dried most of the corn in braids that hung in a dark corner of the cabin, not too near the fire. We kept baskets filled with beans, another with strips of dried squash. The willow basket was supposed to go to Lorraine, and she knew I was lying when I said it was lost. She hated me for keeping these seeds from her. They were her birthright, the only thing left from her old life. But when she came back, everything she touched withered and died. My brothers, her daughter. I couldn't let her have the seeds. Deep down, I think she knew it too. To this day, I don't know if I did right. Maybe they would have helped her find her way back. I couldn't risk it. The old ones told Suzanne that a time was coming when the seeds would go into hiding. They said that people would no longer respect them or the land or the water, that the seeds would leave, some returning to the soil, others simply waiting in darkness. They told her to be ready. Just before she died, my mother gave me the basket. She knew that Lorraine was not coming back, not the girl we had known and loved. The spirit of the schools was too strong, she said, too hungry, and it would not ever let them go. Rosalie, I'm giving you this basket. Find a safe place to grow the seeds. I don't know what else to tell you. Love them like your children, the way you loved your son. Darlene turned to Thomas. Come closer, Takoja. Let me look at you. You have your grandfather's face. I'm going to give you this. From the basket, she withdrew a small object and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a perfectly preserved cob of corn that had faded to a dull, lifeless red. She planted the cob in Thomas's hand and closed his fingers gently around it. This corn has been in our family for many, many generations. It came with the antler so that we would always remember. Take it, Takoja. Maybe it will help you remember. And so throughout the book, then the story moves around in time, and it varies between the different voices of the characters. So in addition to Rosalie, there is Gabby Makepeace, who is Rosalie's best friend, and she was really fun to write. I've known a lot of really fierce Gabbies in my life, and so she was modeled on them. But she's an activist for the water, and so between Rosalie and Gabby, I wanted to show the different paths that you can take in doing this work. So Rosalie becomes a gardener, Gabby becomes an activist, and both paths give you gifts, and they both have their challenges. One of the other characters is Darlene Kilsdeer, and you just heard about her in this excerpt. And she is, she's the last seed keeper in their family. And so she has actually spent much of her life searching for Rosalie while she was in foster care. And then Marie Blackbird is Rosalie's great-great-grandmother. And she is the one that carries some of the sorrow that's in the book that comes through the removal of the Dakota women after the war, and then her family, the children go to boarding school. And so she is carrying that experience. And that's part of, for many Native families, the trauma that rolls through generations. So this is what ends up in Rosalie's generation, so that she doesn't understand why her life has come to the place it has. But if you look back over time, you see how trauma rolls forward across generations. And so the big question that I really am just trying to ask through this book is about our relationship with seeds. And we see how it has evolved and changed so drastically from the time that these Dakota women protected them, really with their lives, and then to where we are today, and in the book in 2002 with genetically modified seeds and the hard choices that farmers have had to make as well. And so the question for me is, so what are the consequences of these changes, and how does that impact not only human beings, but the seeds themselves? And to just think about ourselves as the relative to these seeds, and are these choices the ones that we want to continue making? So I think most of all, my hope is that when you read this book, that you connect what for me is the power and the magic and the beauty of seeds. They give so much, and it has been such joyful work to me to be involved in seeds and food. And so learning the history is part of it, but reconnecting with what is simply the magic of seeds is really what I hope you will get out of the book. So I'm going to read this last, just one paragraph, and it actually, I think, sums up how I think about seeds. And this is Rosalie speaking again when she is just learning how to garden. Everywhere I looked, I saw how seeds were holding the world together. They planted forests, covered meadows with wildflowers, sprouted in the cracks of sidewalks, or lay dormant until the long-awaited moment came, signaled by fire or rain or warmth. They filled the produce aisle in grocery stores. Seeds breathed and spoke in a language all their own. Each one was a miniature time capsule, capturing years of stories in its tender flesh. How ignorant I felt compared to the brilliance contained in a single seed. I had begun to see that when we save these seeds, when we select which ones will be planted again, our lives become braided into the life stories of these plants. Vidamaya. Well, that's my remarks. Now, I believe. So now we chat. Please. Try not to tip the table over.
Diane, thank you so much for sharing with us about your work, for joining us, for giving us this story to help us work through hard things. I'm very grateful, and I'm very grateful that we get to have a conversation about this incredible work. So thank you everyone for being with us. I was thinking as you were talking about my own journey with this book, which I've had the chance to talk with Diane a little bit, and about the seed work that we're doing here at Princeton. And one of the things about seeds that really resonates with me and my students and the colleagues who I get to work with is that they're so honest. They carry these stories, and that's one of the gifts of your book, is it's very honest and promising, gives us avenues and teaches us good ways to walk in the world. If we're reading, the characters are just such incredible models. And for those in the room who have resonated with Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about the way that the seed keeper is in relationship and conversation with that book, and it helped many of us to flesh out some of the stories and concepts that Kimmerer gives us. But these characters are so vibrant and so alive and so relatable, and so the seed keeper is just this wonderful extension that really, I think, does help us to imagine how to walk better in the world. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We were talking a little bit about the conversation we wanted to have with you all today, and I wonder if maybe we should start with Darlene's gift to Thomas, even though that was the last question that I listed, but because you just were in that passage with us. And I shared that when Darlene gives Thomas this cob of corn, and Thomas is in a tough spot in this part at the end of the book. He's really following in the way of a farmer who is expanding and thinking about new biotech seeds, and he's not carrying the teachings of his mother at this moment in the story. And Darlene gives him this cob of corn, and I felt so nervous as a reader, because what is Thomas going to do with this corn? She's giving it to him, and there's just not much left. And so I wonder if you want to start by talking about why does she give it to him? What is Thomas going to do with the corn? What is the corn going to do with Thomas?
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it. So just so you know, that question is not resolved at the end of the book, that I left it as the question that Thomas carries, which really is the choice that we all face about how are we going to walk in the world, not only with seeds themselves, but seeds as a metaphor for everything around us. And so here is Thomas, who is growing up in a mixed family where he really carries that clash between two worldviews, one of which is centered in kinship, and one of which, especially as farms have evolved through, as they become more corporatized, then he's carrying that as well, because his father had to also teach him how to survive in the farm world. So by giving the seeds to Thomas, this extremely precious gift, he is going to be forced to make a choice at some point. He is going to have to choose a path. And I think what Darlene believed is that by holding those seeds himself, he becomes a seed keeper. So in that moment, he has the responsibility. He is carrying them. And what I think she would have hoped is that they would activate for him the teachings that he received early in his life, and even his subconscious, that, what I call blood memory, which is this very deep intuition that resonates with memories that you don't even realize that you're carrying. And I think sometimes when we're writing, that we can actually tap into that place. And so with Thomas, it's that hope that he will tap into that place, because the the teachings of his father are not actually sustainable. This way of farming is not sustainable. So, but he's left. He's left with the question because we all have to wrestle with that.
And in a very real way, Thomas can't grow both corns. For some context on the seed keeping of corn, genetically modified corn's very promiscuous. You need to isolate it by a mile or more. It's friendly. And so Thomas can't grow both corns on the same farm. And where he could even grow that red corn in South Central Minnesota and keep it safe, I'm not sure.
For those of you who may not be familiar with Minnesota, we are, especially the southern half of the state, corn and soybeans primarily are the crops that have replaced the tallgrass prairie that was once our primary ecosystem. But the harsh reality of growing seeds like that is not only can your precious corn be cross-pollinated fairly easily by windborne pollen from a genetically modified seed, but then you could be sued for stealing that genetic material. So that's how our system is rigged on behalf of large corporate farms and genetically modified seeds.
And maybe we should stay in South Central Minnesota for a minute and think about Rosalie on the Meister farm and what you were doing in putting Rosalie and John in a family together.
So really, I was trying to portray the two worldviews side by side. So we have John is white. His family was some of the original settlers in the area. And then we have Rosalie, who is Dakota, whose people are indigenous to this area. And the differences in those two cultures come into play in their relationship. And then they play out in the way that they raise their son. So by having them married, it gave me as a writer a way to show the clash between these two worldviews, these very different ways of relating to land and seeds. So that was actually, I have to say, that was a really interesting way to explore the way culture gets played out in mixed families, and particularly in central Minnesota, which you are familiar with. But it's a really conservative area that holds on tightly to the stories of what has brought settlers into this area.
So when this book landed in my hands this past summer, I was starting a project with colleagues and students called The Seed Farm, and growing some rare culturally meaningful seeds, including some indigenous seeds at a site that's about 10 minutes from here. And a colleague, Sarah Rivet, recommended that I read this book and we think about teaching it in the course that we're working on this semester. I had no idea it was set in my hometown. So I grew up in New Ulm, Minnesota. I was born in the hospital in Mankato, Minnesota, which is a half an hour away because New Ulm is a small town. And Mankato is the slightly bigger town where the hospital is, and my pediatrician and I would go to Mankato for school clothes shopping and doctor's visits. And New Ulm, Minnesota, and the Minnesota River Valley when I was growing up, it was 98% ethnically German. It was the most homogenous town in the country. Not 98% white, but 98% ethnically German. My grandfather had a pair of Lederhosen. Everyone I knew had Lederhosen in the closet. We celebrated Heritage Fest and Oktoberfest. It's named New Ulm after Ulm, Germany. There is a statue on the hill. There is a hill, and we call it the hill, and there's a statue on the hill that's several stories tall with a German warrior holding a sword over his head. His name is Herman the German. And he looks over the town. And so, and the way that the Dakota War is talked about, if it's talked about at all, is monumentalized in this very defensive, sympathetic to the white settlers in the area, and not a very full story about what the experiences of the Dakota people who were removed from their homeland as a result of the Homestead Act of 1862, what the full experience is, and you know, sort of the reason and motivation for the wartime, and no conversation about removal whatsoever. And so there's cracks and fissures in the story of my hometown, right? Like, so this is the Minnesota River Valley. We all knew we were on Dakota land, but there were no Dakota people. But the story of German heritage and sort of this ethnic nationalism was so strong that it precluded all the other stories that were possible there. And so it was a very, it was a profound reading experience for me, thinking about the legacy of the Dakota War and the place that I grew up with, and through the lens of seeds when I was facilitating a project that was working with Indigenous seeds and participating in some work around rematriation. But to have you craft John and Rosalie in relationship with each other, and Thomas as a child, and for you to find space in your novel for sympathy for the farmers who were resisting corporatization and trying to kind of, you know, carry on a more traditional organic sort of farming legacy, that was just profound. And I wonder about what it took as a writer to make, as a Dakota writer, to make space for those characters to have some pain as well.
So it actually was really important to me to show farmers in a fair and compassionate perspective, that you know, this is a really volatile, emotionally fraught history and remains so in Minnesota. But the fact that there were farmers who were trying to also take care of the land. So especially when they worked as subsistence, in the beginning, the subsistence farmers took care of their families, and they took care of the soil by raising animals and returning the manure to the soil. And so they were part of this cycle of actually caring for land and water. And I wanted to acknowledge that, and I also wanted to acknowledge what happened after World War II, when war chemicals were then diverted into agriculture, and how that then created this system that pretty much has squeezed out that kind of farming, that it is almost impossible to survive as a compassionate farmer who is connected to their land and animals. So I wanted also to reflect on the space that you mentioned. For me, is the commons. So how do we all, as human beings, come together to do the work around caring for land, animals, plants, and water and seeds? And that to show that, for example, Rosalie begins by growing John's mother's seeds. She cared for them. She was a seed keeper. She was doing this work. And that this was a way for Rosalie to come back to her own family's legacy of seeds. Means we have commons between all of us that are spaces where I think we can build relationships, and we can also build a network of support around resisting the systems that have been pretty much simply placed upon us, these choices around our foods, and then what the consequences of that system in what happens to land and water. And so when I think about, what we're experiencing through this climate crisis, for me, it comes all the way back to, well, what is our relationship now, individually, with land and water? And then see how that has exponentially grown into this crisis, and that maybe the way in which we address it is on the local level, that we do this work together. So it's really an important theme in the book, this idea of commons.
And thinking about that relationship, building that relationship, you give us a lot of different characters in the book. We have Gabby Makepeace, Aunt Vera, John, Judith and George, Ida. If you haven't read the book, when you do, you'll get to know all of these characters. Wilma, Carlos, Darlene, and they're all relating to Rosalie in different ways. Some of the characters are Indigenous, some are not Indigenous. And I just wonder, what are the ways, and this might be the closing question for us, we'll open it up for a few minutes for Q&A from the audience before we do some book signing. But what are ways that those of us who are gathered here might be in good relationship with someone like Rosalie and good relationship with the lands that we live on?
So this has been an interesting part of the conversation we've been having for 2 days, because it's a vague line between learning cultural teachings and appropriating cultural teachings. And, we're all trying to be as careful as we can to be respectful. And so how do we know the difference? And so Tessa and I were talking about this today, and I said, to me, it comes down to how do we act as a good guest on the land? And so if you see yourself as a guest here, and I think especially for students who come from different areas, but while we are that guest, how do we behave in a responsible way that honors the hospitality of a traditional homeland? So you think of the Lenape people who cared for this land for so many years as their homeland, and then what has changed on it as you and other generations have been guests here? And then what can you do to protect it, to make changes that honor the fact that we are here on Lenape Hoking? And so and I feel that way where I live in Minnesota. I'm on 10 acres, and often talk about the tamarack bog that I'm so fond of. But so as a guest, I will be there a certain number of years, and then I'll leave. And so what happens to that land? What happens to that bog? And so I'm thinking, in my time here on this land, how can I protect it? How can I care for it in a way that hopefully leaves it even stronger and healthier for the next person, the next guest to come along? So that's my approach to trying to navigate these very sensitive cultural and political questions.
Diane Wilson is the only person I know who has the credential bog steward in her email signature. I'm seeding a future question.
So thank you so much, both Tessa and Diane. Sorry, did you have a question? No. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? I think of seeds as promise or hope. There are so many stories now. You talk about GMOs. Like, what are you seeing as seeds of hope in the work that you're doing or otherwise?
Every time I think I visit a community or a group, especially students, and I get to hear what they're thinking about the future, or I hear of projects like the seed farm, that's what gives me hope, is to see people finding a way back into these relationships that, in a way that I think we were meant to be as human beings. And so, but I do especially love visiting universities because of the idealism that I feel coming from students, and that thoughtfulness and the freshness of perspective. Like, we clearly have not improved the situation out in the world, but we have these new minds coming up that also give me hope.
Thank you. Yes, please, thanks. I have more questions, but it's not mine.
I'm wondering, because you talked about how in the book there are these stories of different women in the same family, and then you have the character Thomas. So why did you create Thomas as kind of Rosalie's offspring versus like a daughter, like continuing that kind of narrative?
That's a good question. You know, I don't have a conscious, intentional thought about why that happened, other than I may have been seeding that next novel, that, you know, wanting, because I know that I want to explore the role of young Native men and the different kind of challenges that they faced, especially, you know, in the way the culture has changed over that past 100 to 200 years. And, you know, it may be that that's why that was. And I didn't want to exclude men from the book. And I didn't want to, you know, cast them in roles that felt inconsequential or, so I think I needed, partly for balance, I needed another male character. Yeah, thank you for that.
You asked for questions that would make you pause.
Love it.
This is something else that I'm thinking, and in some ways is a follow-up question to that, but Rosalie's father as well is like another fairly substantial male character that, to me, kind of broke that trend as well, in that it felt like it was set apart from the continuity of the kind of generational series of women that were acted as seed keepers. And what was kind of the significance of Rosalie's main mentor being her father rather than her mother early in her life? Was it that same kind of balance? Were there other motivations there? I don't know.
So her father is another interesting character to me, and we talked about this a little bit in class yesterday, where the you know, part of what I've observed and in the way that families have changed over time through, especially after the impacts and consequences of boarding schools, was to see traditional families who considered their children as sacred. And that was a traditional way of raising children. And then to see all of the challenges now today in our communities, and, you know, you know, for example, the high rate of suicide among Native youth. And to think, well, how did we get from this place where children are sacred to a place where children are under such threat? And to me, it's all the trauma in the middle, and that we are still living out that trauma. And so Ray actually he embodies that trauma in the conflict in his own life. So he's an alcoholic. So, and that's how he medicates that pain. But at the same time, he loves his daughter. So he tries to give her tools to survive no matter what comes, even though he's disappearing for days. So he, in that way, embodies that struggle that is going on in our communities today.
Thank you. Tessa, may I ask you to speak briefly about the work you're doing at the Seed Farm, to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So where to start? So we've started a project recently. We'll be in our second season this year through at the university called the Seed Farm, where we grow rare, culturally meaningful seeds in deep community with community organizations that are doing a wide range of sort of food sovereignty, food justice work. And so at the center of the Seed Farm project are 3 community partners. The Experimental Farm Network, which is based in South Jersey, that's thinking about using heirloom genetics for climate resilience and plant breeding efforts. The Muncie Three Sisters Medicinal Farm, which is a farm of the Ramapo Lenape Turtle Clan in North Jersey, that's really about community healing and food sovereignty work. And then partnered with the Ujamaa Cooperative Farming Alliance, just a collection of BIPOC farmers up and down the Eastern Seaboard, Black and Indigenous-led organization. And each of the partners is doing very different type of work around food justice and food sovereignty. And our part here at the university is that our partners ask us or give us seeds that they'd like help multiplying. You know, Diane talked about how Dream of Wild Health started with just literally a handful of seeds. There's actually a lot of varieties of plants and heirlooms and sacred seeds that we literally just have handfuls of. The metaphor of the seeds sleeping and the agreement kind of diminishing is not only metaphoric, it's very, very much real. And so the Seed Farm plays a role in the organizations that we work with, give us seeds that they're working on multiplying to help do whatever work they're doing in their communities around these issues. And we learn to be in relationship with those seeds, tend them, grow them in the ways that our community partners teach us. And then at the end of the season, we return the multiplication of those seeds back to the community organizations so they can keep doing their good work. And while the seeds are here with us and we're stewarding them, we also are very happy to pursue any research questions that community partners have about seeds that range from archive to science and anything in between to leverage the resources of the university for use in that community work. And so that's a little bit about the project. Mandy is one of our seed farmers from this past summer. And so you can talk to Mandy as well about it. Sarah is a key collaborator and champion of the project. Is really the person who said, hey, that sounds like a good idea, let's make it happen. And so Alice and Blue Lab were working together. So there's a lot of great collaboration in the room around it. And it was just such a joy to share that project with you, Diane, and have you share that it was pleasing to you.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see it happen.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to emphasize that this seed work is also happening here.
Thank you so much, Diane, for sharing your work writ large and the work of the novel with us tonight, and Tessa for being in conversation and for having this event. My mind keeps traveling back to the 1972 U.S. Plant Variety Protection Act as this conversation has unfolded and as you read from your novel. That act generated almost no public comment or public attention at the time, but ended up being profound in laying this foundation for intellectual property rights to follow mostly corporate owners of first the cuttings of asexual plants and germplasm in the language of the bill, i.e. seeds, but by the time of the U.S. Supreme Court decisions in this century for genetic traits themselves, including pigmentation and so on. And so one of the ways that the Supreme Court keeps coming down on the side of corporate patent and seed license holders, Monsanto being the most sort of charismatic of them, is through an analogy of software. Seed is software. And so I was thinking about this, just really was drawn to by Tessa's point about varieties in which there are just a handful, let's say. And software, that metaphor is like viral, right? It's about like the capacity to replicate on a large scale of the commodity germplasm. And so I'm just sort of curious, like for you, that that history in US federal statute and court precedent that finds germplasm to be a technology like software, and then to afford patent rights accordingly. Like, how do you use the work of narrative as well as the work of native food sovereignty in the ground to like counter that framework?
That's a great question. So this is what happens when you don't come to your work as a relative. You know, you remove life from it, you remove care from it, and it becomes something that can be treated as something extractive and used to make profit. And so this has been such a difficult and ongoing conversation for small groups. I mean, we're all like grassroots doing this work, fighting, you know, these very large corporations. So what we came up with was to grow our seeds, and actually when we share them, to use seed packets that contain language, that it's somewhat responsive to the kind of language that Monsanto uses, but it says by opening this package and using these seeds, you're agreeing to basically continue them as part of the commons. And so whether or not that would stand up in a court, who knows, but it felt like a protective step. And if we could demonstrate that these are seeds that we have been growing out and are in our possession, and you show that kind of lineage, and then you have this protective language, to do that without resorting to the similar tools of patenting. So we didn't want to go down that path because, you know, that's it's the challenge of, you don't want to become like the institution that is oppressing you. You have to stay on your path, even though it may cost you down the road. So this is what we came up with. We grow them and we share them. And to me, that's how we protect them. You grow it out, you share it back with the community. If they're your seeds, you share them with your friends and your family. And the more we get seeds grown out in multiple places, the safer they are. Because then if I have raccoons and you have frost, maybe your crop comes through, and, you know, and then we all benefit. And then we don't have to worry so much about the inbreeding too. So, you know, and the beauty of that is that the seeds are building community with us when we're doing it. Yeah, so when we do this from that right place, we build community and we find joy in the work, and we have beautiful foods again. So to me, it just feels so, you can tell when you're in that right, just on that right path, because it all works and there's joy and beauty returning to the work. But yeah, it's a scary world out there.
What a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much. We'll have to hold the bog steward question for the next book when you come back.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you so much, Tessa. Thank you all.
Diane will be with us up here. I brought extra seeds from my seed stash for anyone who wants to take them, seeds I know I'm not going to be able to grow. So, thank you.
Do you have any produce that you use from what you grow? Or is it all
At the farm.
At the farm.
So, I mean, this first year was really just like
Okay.
making a road into the market.